Hello and welcome back as we start this section on identity and access management. Up to this point, we have reviewed what the account and services layer is, as well as the physical and networking layer. And now we're going to dive into our first service, identity and access management. So the first thing that you're going to notice is that our diagram has changed here and it has now components that are relevant to identity and access management. So we can read here that now we have moved into a more detailed view of IAM. Here you can view an example of various ways different users and resources access an S3 bucket, including all the IAM components required, such as users, groups, roles, policies, and API keys. So what we have here is we have an S3 bucket down here, and we have the root user, AWS users, as well as an on-premise data center or an on-premise office building where you may have non-AWS account holders. And what we're doing here is looking at all the various ways that if these different types of users, also including an EC2 instance here, if all of these various users or other AWS resources wanted to access things in this S3 bucket, how would that be managed through IAM? What components would be required to set up in order for each of these individuals or services to access the S3 bucket? So we're now going to talk specifically about IAM Essentials and get a good overview of what IAM is and best practices. But first, over here in the console, let's discover where to find identity and access management. And that can be for here under recently viewed services. I actually have that listed here. But if you're looking at your console and it looks like this, you can click on all services and find IAM under security, identity, and compliance. So click on that to open up identity and access management. And if you've created a new account, then you should have a console that looks like this with the security statuses here with 1 checked and 4 needing attention. So over here on the Orion papers, let's click on IAM Essentials. So let's talk briefly about what identity and access management is. And for the purposes of this course, it is where you manage your AWS users, groups, and roles and their access to AWS accounts and services. IAM provides access and access permissions to AWS resources such as EC2, S3, and DynamoDB, just as a few examples. IAM is global to all AWS regions. Creating a new user account will apply to all regions. So if you notice here, when I went into IAM, up here it states global. IAM does not require region selection. As where if I were to go to a different service, let's just say I go back to the console, the main page of the console, you'll see here that I'm now in the North Virginia region and I can select other regions as well. But the second I go into IAM, it locks it and says it's global. So you're not working within any particular region when you are using IAM. The common use of IAM is to manage users, groups, roles, IAM access policies or permission policies, API keys, and to specify a password policy as well as manage multi-factor authentication requirements on a per account user basis. By default, and this is very important, any new IAM user you create in an AWS account is created with no access to any AWS services. This is what is called a non-explicit deny rule, which is set on all new users. So, as a root user, we know that a root user is by default configured with access to all AWS services. But if I were to now create a new user here, that user by default will be created with no rights to anything, meaning that if I were to then log in as that user, they would not be able to access any AWS resources or any AWS services. So for those users and anyone besides the root user, permissions must be given that grant access to AWS services. So if a user that I create wants to access EC2, I have to explicitly grant permission to that user for them to access the AWS service EC2. Next, it's important to understand that when a new AWS root account is created, which I'm logged in here as my root account, it is best practice to complete the tasks listed in IAM under security status, which include delete your root access keys, which should be done automatically when you create a new account, activate multi-factor authentication on your root account, create individual IAM users, and that's something for best practice, which we'll get into in a minute. Use groups to assign permissions, which we're going to learn how to do, and also apply an IAM password policy, which is good for increased security purposes. Also, it is best practice to log in and do daily work as an IAM user, not as the root user. So even if you are the root user account holder, it is best practice for you to create, let's say, an admin user, which we'll do in a minute, and then log in as the admin user, not as the root user. That is what is considered best practice when using Amazon Web Services. It is also best to practice the principle of least privilege when administering AWS accounts, users, groups, and roles. And what the principle of least privilege means is that if I have a user that only needs access to an S3 bucket, then the permissions or the policies that I give to that user should only grant them permission to access that S3 bucket or to read from that S3 bucket. They shouldn't also have access to EC2 or DynamoDB or CloudFormation or any other AWS services because they don't need access to those services to do their job. So you only want to grant permissions and level of access to what the user specifically needs. And this is best practice for the best security that you can have on your AWS accounts. So for the remainder of this lesson, let's go through and check off these items here, which we need to complete in order to meet the best practices when creating a new account. So activate multi-factor authentication on your account. Now, this can be done through a virtual device or through a physical device like a key fob that you can order through Amazon Web Services. For my purposes, I always use a virtual device which you can download Google Authenticate onto your smartphone and use that. But what you want to do is you want to click on Manage MFA, select Virtual Device, select Next Steps, and then you want to download an appropriate application like Google Authenticate onto your smartphone. And then it's going to walk you through some steps using that application to take the picture of the QR code here and then walk through the step-by-step process of setting up the authentication. You can then activate the virtual MFA device and use your smartphone as that device. Next, we want to create an individual IAM user. Now, we're going to go much more into detail about users in the next lesson, but here what we want to do is click on Users, click on Add User, and I'm going to create now the framework for what is going to be our admin user, which I will then use for the remainder of this course. So I'll just input the name here of admin. And there are two options here called Programmatic Access, which will give us our access keys, as well as AWS Management Console Access. Now, we'll go into more detail about both of these in following lessons, but I will check both of these to, one, create a set of access keys for myself for my admin user, but then also for Management Console access, which again, this is the Management Console, we want to either auto-generate a password for this user or create a custom password for this user. Since I'm going to be using this user myself, I'll just create a custom password now for this particular user. And here you can require a password reset the next time that the user signs in, and that's generally a good thing if you auto-generate a password. But since I just created a custom password for myself, I'll uncheck that and then next go to permissions. Now, for permissions, I'm not going to set those right now because I'm going to do that in the next lesson. So I will just click Review and go on to the next steps. And it states here that the user has no permissions. So again, remember that when a new user is created, by default, they have no permissions. So let me go here and create the user. So I now have my user. His name is admin, and you can see here my access key ID, secret key ID, and we will go into more detail about that into our lesson on API keys. But I'll now close out here. We can go back to the dashboard, and we do now see that creating an individual IAM user has been successful. Next is we can use groups to assign permissions. So it wants us here to create a group and use that to assign permissions to other IAM users. Now, we'll go into more detail about groups in the next lesson, but let's go ahead and manage a group. We'll create one here so that we can meet this need. So we'll give my group a name. I'm going to call this admin group. And it says here that group name must contain 128 characters and only alphanumeric characters. So it looks like here I can't have a space. So let me put a dash in there. It's going to ask me to attach a policy. And what I'll do at this point is just go to next steps. I'm not going to attach a policy at this point. I will do that in another video, and then we'll create the group. So I now have a group called admin group, which has no policies attached to it. I also have a user called admin, which has no policies attached to it. So right now the user and the group are offering no rights and no permissions. Moving back to the dashboard, we now see here, apply an IAM password policy. So what we'll do here is we'll go on manage password policies. And what password policies allow you to do is to set rules that define the types of password an IAM user can set. So this is the length, whether it requires an uppercase letter, lowercase letters, whether it will require a number, whether passwords need to be rotated after a couple of weeks or after a month or two, after 90 days. You can set all of those types of rules for your password here. So here I will require, let's see, at least one uppercase, one lowercase, one number, and must be a minimum length of, let's say, 8. And then I can look at those rules. And if I'm happy with those rules and those meet the rules that are required by my company or my institution, then I can set those and click on apply password policy. And that will then apply to any IAM user that I create. And when they go to create a password for themselves, they will have to follow these rules. And again, you can always come back here and delete the password policy, and always feel free to change this as you see fit. So moving back to the dashboard, we now see that all of these items have been completed. Again, the multi-factor authentication is something that you can do on your own. I'm not going to do that here in this video. And what I want to show you specifically in this video now is, how do I now log in as an IAM user, not as the root user? Well, if you look right up top here, you see a link here, and it says IAM user sign-in link. So if you ever need to find this particular link, you can just grab that here. So I'm going to copy that, and I'll paste it. And it's going to bring us to a slightly different login screen than if you're logging in as the root user. So here you can see it has the account number, and then we're going to put in the username, which was admin, and the password that I created for myself. Great, so now you can see that I'm logged in as my admin user and no longer as the root user. However, if you remember, I have not assigned any access permissions or permission policies to this user. So even though I can open the console, if I click on any service, so for instance, let's go to EC2, it's going to tell me that I don't have any access or authorization to do anything here. Same thing if I go back and I click on S3, it's going to alert me and say that I don't have any permission at all. So we're going to have to grant some permissions for this user so we can continue on with this course, but I'm going to pick up on that in our next video when we talk about policies. So with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.